Please welcome Kirsten Barnes, Luyanda Hlajwayo, Thokozani Masilela, Linda Godfrey, Kavinyan Dorasamy, and Kevin O'Brien as they discuss how we transition towards a circular economy for plastics.
Linda Godfrey, I want to bring you in on the issue of addressing plastic waste, and one way is to obviously grow the demand for it by growing local end-use markets and increasing recycled content in new plastic products. But to do this economically, I think industry needs access to larger volumes of high-quality waste plastic. That's just the economics of it. But consistent supply of large volumes of high-quality plastic waste feedstock remains a major hurdle here in South Africa in particular. What will it take to scale up the collection of waste plastic, and what role will separation of post-consumer waste play?
Thanks, Michael. So I think, if we focus specifically on post-consumer waste plastic, because I think there's already sort of sufficient demand for pre-consumer and industrial plastics by recyclers. So focusing in on those short-lived plastic products, those single-use plastic waste streams, I think certainly the new extended producer responsibility regulations and the schemes that will come from it, and the EPR was alluded to in various of the presentations over the 2 days. Government has set now legal targets for collection and recycling. And I think this is an important first step to increasing volumes of clean material. It's somewhat unfortunate that we've lost nearly 5 years in terms of the implementation of mandatory EPR in South Africa, but I'm really hoping that we can now fast track the implementation of EPR going forward. I think the question, I guess, we need to be asking is how do we implement EPR at least cost to producers and ultimately to consumers in South Africa, especially when we're talking about plastic packaging, because this typically relates to foodstuffs. I mean, we could roll out massive collection systems, but this would come at significant costs, which are passed down to consumers. We also recognize that we have a very large informal waste sector who's reliant on these recyclables for their livelihoods and play an incredibly valuable role between, in bridging the service chain and the value chain. And so we need to implement collection systems in a way that is inclusive and that recognizes the important role that informal waste reclaimers play. And I'm sure Luyanda will touch on this and emphasize this point as well. So I think with this as background, to get more plastics, we could probably create more demand, as you said. We could increase both informal and formal collection, and I think we're probably going to need a combination of these going forward. But to get more clean plastics, I believe we're going to have to implement some kind of separation at source. And what will that practically look like for South Africa? So I think the next year or two are going to be really important in terms of shaping our national collection systems. Personally, from my side, I'd love to see municipalities putting separate collection systems in place for organic waste. So your food waste and your garden waste, your wet municipal waste, leaving behind a relatively clean mixed recyclable or residual waste stream, which includes your recyclable plastics. So this would then leave us with a clean organic waste stream that we could recover value from, and it would leave us with a relatively clean mixed recyclable waste stream that we could recover value from. The problem is, we know the current state of many of our municipalities, unfortunately, and the breakdown in services that we've seen at a municipal level. So I think the important question really going forward is, who's going to implement separation at source and ultimately who's going to pay for it? I think that for me is really the million-dollar question in terms of how we practically implement EPR moving forward. Thanks, Michael.
And I think, to the capacity constraints that you mentioned, and in the spirit of Tuma Mina, there's got to be an increased scope here for public-private partnership and in this collaborative spirit as well. Luyanda, just from the informal waste pickers' perspective, what do you see it taking to scale up the collection of waste plastic, and what do you see the role of separation of post-consumer waste playing?
I think firstly, I just need to highlight that reclaimers in South Africa have actually created a very simple system of bringing materials outside of the landfill from going to environment and be able to feed themselves through a working collection system that has been working for over 20 years now, without being paid for services rent. If any municipality had to employ a service provider to do collection of recyclables, guaranteed they will have to be paid for the services rendered. And the reason why we are informal is because we are not paid for the services that we are providing. It's pretty much clear on that. Separation at source programs never actually worked because it was just a concept that did not go with education in it. Now, with reclaimers who are doing it on a daily basis, we not only collecting, we are sorting materials, we are storing materials with no resources, with no payment of services provided, which I think are the main key issues. Dr. Linda Godfrey will help us with that, but there's tons of materials that are being stored in parks, that are being stored in hidden buildings around the city, that are being hidden literally because the informal sector is not supported, the informal sector is undermined with the work that they're doing, and the industry is very much comfortable with the system that has been coming in, and reclaimers have literally cut costs, the logistical costs of transporting materials from neighborhoods and bringing them all in one central area, which is why industries end up creating buyback centers, because they know that reclaimers will definitely bring the materials in it. So firstly, it would be payment for services that are being provided. You know, the unpaid labor that has been going through for such a long time needs to change. You know, people are working a lot, and there's a lot of materials that are being moved out of the waste stream. We've got guys at the landfill, which I personally believe they are, I call them the last line of defense. You know, when the trucks, the municipal trucks come, drop off materials, you find groups of people coming in digging materials literally that are being thrown by municipalities in the landfill. That system is not being supported, and that system has been able to save our landfill and has been able to save plastic literally from being buried. There's no proper infrastructure for us to be able to store the materials that are coming in. So if you are saying we're collecting 80 to 90% of post-consumer plastic, where do you think it's being stored? I think the industry just got very comfortable in saying, well, the informal sector is going to do it anyway. Whether we pay them or we don't pay them, they will do it. I think that is the biggest problem that we're facing in South Africa for the informal sector.
I think very powerful words there, Leonda. And Linda, to come back to you, in this value chain, in this spirit of collaboration, what role do you see for the brand owners in supporting or driving greater collection of waste plastic at the end of life? Because Leonda was saying it is a question now of remunerating labor for the work that it's doing as well.
Thanks, Michael. I think that, you know, it's a very tricky space we're entering into here, because we're trying to roll out a very advanced policy instrument in terms of extended producer responsibility within a developing country landscape. And there is this complexity of having a very vibrant and active and very efficient and very effective informal waste sector playing in the space. And the question is, how do we integrate the informal sector into an advanced policy instrument like extended producer responsibility? So I think this is one of the key questions that is currently being discussed amongst producers, including brand owners, in terms of how do we integrate them into an EPR scheme, into a collection scheme, you know, what role do they play? And as I said, we're probably going to need a combination of both, a combination of informal and formal, just in terms of achieving the kinds of mandatory targets that have been set by government. They are stretching targets. And for certain plastic streams, it's going to require ramping up collection and recycling quite significantly. So I think brand owners, there's a responsibility that falls on them, not just simply in terms of paying as producers towards EPR, but again, making sure that their products are designed for circularity, which drives greater collection. And as I think both Kevin and Kavinian have said, I think producers, brand owners, retailers understand that they are part of a bigger system and understanding the role that they play in this system. So I think, and I hope, and from what I've seen they have been, is that brand owners are coming to the table, to the discussions of actually how we drive greater collection. I want to touch on the point that Luyanda mentioned around, informal reclaimers as the last line of defense. It speaks to the point we discussed earlier about access to more cleaner material. And certainly informal reclaimers themselves have said that reclaiming off of landfills and dump sites in South Africa is not a long-term objective. Nobody wants to be working in those kinds of conditions on our disposal sites. So we're wanting to move reclaimers off of the dump sites closer to the source of this material where they can access cleaner material, which obviously means more money in their pocket when they sell the material as well. So again, I think this point's been reiterated so many times, is that it's going to mean coming together, it's going to mean partnerships, and it's going to require very honest and open discussions in terms of how we solve the plastic waste problem. Thanks, Michael.
Luyanda, I want to come back to you on the issue of brand owners. What do you see as their role here in driving greater collection of waste plastic at the end of life?
Collaboration. There's collaborations that have already started, for example, with Unilever, on how do we start finding ways of paying reclaimers, what we're doing. Recognizing the invisible people that are within the economy and engaging with reclaimers on the types of plastic that actually have value. You may talk about styrofoam being recyclable, but for us, it's a waste of time because doesn't actually have value. So engagements don't have to end up on the top part of it. But engagements also need to come down and engage with the reclaimers themselves. That why is this type of material not being collected? We will tell you the reason why it's not being collected, because there's no value for it. So the industries may talk whatever they were to say in terms of this is the amount of efforts that we put it in, but at the end of the day, I will only pick something that has value. And right now, very few materials have value. That is why we find a lot of materials at the landfill. Just to add on what Linda Godfrey had said, and I agree with, it's very important that we remove reclaimers out of the landfill, but without the reclaimers at the landfill, we are going to have tons of material being buried. We already have a lot of material that is being collected from households. We have something that we call it separation outside source, which your municipal services would never be able to do, because they only concentrate on the plastic that is being collected. Reclaimers are going in open parks, collecting materials in illegal dumping sites, wherever there's cardboard in the middle of the street, something that the formal sector can never do. Because we are self-employed, something that we're doing on our own. We are able to go in, even in spaces that your normal municipal services would not be able to go through. Which is why I still insist the provision of infrastructure for the informal economy, the recognition of the workers that are actually doing the work, and making a point that you pay for the services that are being rendered. And we are busy creating pilots on how industries can start engaging with the informal sector on how to start paying reclaimers. So there's a lot of pilots that we're busy with currently on the practical mode of it, how to start paying reclaimers a service fee. And they are currently working very well.
Kavinian, I've left you last on this purposely so you could listen to what Dr. Linda Godfrey and Luyanda have had to say about what they think the brand owners should be doing here. From your vantage point as Unilever, what do you make of these suggestions, and how are you thinking about coming to the table?
So I think in terms of the suggestions, I think very much aligned. And I think we're very much in support of that, and we've also made very public commitments specifically around collection, and this is obviously a global commitment, but we obviously need to look at it from a very local perspective and what works from a local perspective. I think our collection journey is in terms of the target itself, we want to collect more than we actually put out into the environment. which is still, I think, very much in its infancy. Yes, we're making traction towards it, and we continue, to pursue that. I think the EPR is a good mover towards it because it's very much aligned to our targets. So we see it as a very positive move in the industry. And again, like everyone on the panel has said, it's about collaboration, and there's so many collaborations happening at the moment with various collection organizations and bodies. That's our stance right now.
And I think, EPR has been mentioned several times. It does come down to policies. And Thokozani, to bring you in on this point, I think policies and obviously strict enforcement of those policies, which way does government go? Is it more stick? Is it more carrot? Obviously plays this important role in reshaping the way we think about plastic and manage plastic products. What are some of the policies, legislation, regulation that we currently have in place to deal with waste plastic? And if you were to assess their effectiveness, how would you rate them? Thokozani, maybe you're on mute?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Michael, thanks for the question. I think just to kick off, waste in South Africa is governed by a number of pieces of legislation. Just to name few. One, you have the plastic bag regulation of 2003, which calls for a bag to be recyclable and make it more environmentally friendly. Two, you have the National Environmental Management, that the Waste Act of 2008, which mainly regulate waste management and securing ecological sustainable development. You have the National Environmental Management Waste Amendment Act of 2014, which then calls for waste management plans. Section 17 of the Waste Act requires a minimum recycled content on a plastic product. Essentially, what it does, it creates a market for recycling. At the moment, it applies to a refuse bag, right? I think fellow panelists have spoken quite extensively about the EPR, which again will also be contributing to separation at source and setting a recycling target. Equally, at this point, Michael, worth mentioning is that we have a draft plastic master plan, and one of the themes identified within the plan itself, it's sustainability. I think we all in agreement that the transition from fossil fuel based to renewable, it's quite key. It's something that will take us forward. I think if one were to assess the effectiveness, I think at this point in time, to be quite frank, the policies might not have yielded the desired results at this point in time, and hence we're having this kind of reflection. But I still maintain these are good policies. I think what we need to strengthen and firm up is the actual implementation of these policies. Thanks, Michael.
Thokozani, it is an age-old problem in South Africa. Great laws, great intentions, perhaps poor enforcement, and we'll come back to that. Kevin, from your vantage point at SPAR, what do you make of the policies, both industrial and environmental, and whether or not they're having the desired effect, and perhaps why, if they aren't having the desired effect, you think they aren't?
Michael, again, I just want to take a step back. And I'm sorry that I keep doing this. It's just, for me, really important that sometimes we think very carefully about the way we've traditionally looked at things. So, legislation, regulation, we all know, are unfortunately the consequence of people or organizations not willing to do what is right. Okay. So we end up with regulation, and then we decide that we're going to do what's right. And the regulation often will stimulate a certain type of behavior, which is not necessarily in the interest of improving what we are actually trying to achieve. So the South African Plastics Pact, and Kirsten has mentioned that, provides an opportunity for a collective of organizations, people, to commit to responsible plastic and to the circular economy. This is a voluntary arrangement. And in conjunction with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the South African Plastic Pact provides its members the collective platform, which I think is really important, to work towards the vision of a circular economy and also what the most effective uses of responsible plastic in particular. So, tax incentives are often things that are dangled. Tax incentives are often things that are dangled in front of corporate businesses to entice them to do things. But unfortunately, they are traditional mechanisms, in my opinion, and they're used to entice the unwilling to comply. And often that's because they'll financially benefit from that compliance. The carrot should really be the achievement of a circular economy for plastic in this particular instance. And that's why, in my opening answer to the question, I came back to why are we doing this? We should not be doing this for the financial benefit we get out of doing it. There is nothing wrong in incentives. But if we look at, and Luanda spoke about the role of the waste picker. The thing is that we need to respect that role. We need to understand what the informal sector looks like. And once we have that understanding, and we have an understanding, and I'll go back again to what I've said on a couple of occasions, of the system that's at play, we can then introduce incentives in the correct way to drive the system change that's needed. But what we always fall into is not dealing with the issue in the right fashion, because we're not driven by the right reason for doing it. And then we incentivize in exactly the same way as we incentivize that created the problem in the SOP. So at times, I have to say that I despair, whereby I think to bring about the changes that are needed, it's like running into a brick wall over and over again. And just at some point in time, you've got to say to yourself, everybody, there's got to be another way of doing this. Okay. And so a respect for what happens within the system, a respect for the people who are playing their part in that system, and we all have a part to play in it, and then an understanding of how we improve the system together will create regulation, incentives, or whatever it might be to the right places within that system. And thereby will bring about permanent, sustainable future change.
I often think about regulation and I ask, well, what mischief or what market failure is this regulation trying to address? And I do sometimes see a major misalignment between the remedy that is imposed, and once again, I'll come back to the plastic bag tax and the outcome, and how circular that particular feedback loop is from government's perspective. Thokozani, what do you think we need to drive a more circular plastics economy from the DTIC's perspective?
Thanks, Michael, once again. I think in the main, there are certain policies that we need to sort of adopt that would make it possible for us to embrace circular economy, as it were. I mean, policies that advocates for the following. I mean, the reuse of a plastic product, a repair, a refurbishment to improve the product, the remanufacturing of the product to create a new product from a second-hand, repurpose, recycle, and recover. I think what we equally need again, it's policy around public procurement. I mean, government is the biggest consumer of goods and services. I think we need to use the buying power of government to drive a circular economy, as it were. I think what we equally need is the establishment of a harmonized quality standard for recycled material. wherein we therefore need to create a market for recycled and recyclates, right? Some of the incentives that probably I think we need to come up with, it's around technological incentives, the development of a technological solution and innovation for circular economy. We need education incentives, raising awareness on the benefit of the circular economy, regulatory incentives as well, fiscal incentive wherein we mobilize finances for circular economy transition. Market condition, I think incentives to create a market for secondary raw material, reused, remanufactured product. I think broadly, I think that's what we need, Michael, at this point in time. Thanks, Michael.
And hopefully, Thokozani, as well, addressing some of those capacity constraints and issues at local government level. Luyanda, what would you like to see from the waste pickers' perspective? What sort of policies do you think we need to see to achieve this vision of a circular plastics economy?
Inclusion. I mean, for example, if you were to listen to what Thokozani has mentioned right now, it does not include claiming. It includes every part of the value chain. It's supporting every part of the value chain, but it's not talking about support of the actual people that actually bring in the raw material. If you're not supporting the people that are bringing in the raw material, how are you supposed to get the industry to run? It's important to support the people that are bringing in the raw material, that are sustaining the environment, and are bringing in the material. I think we need to emphasize on the importance of supporting the system that has been working. Maybe at some point we need to integrate into that system instead of us getting that system to integrate into another system. You know, it's important that the free labor that has been going on must stop. The recognition of reclaimers and the work that they're doing needs to be acknowledged. I think what Thokozani has just mentioned made it clear. There's recognition on all levels of the value chain, but the actual people that are bringing in the raw materials, there's no mention to it.
I think this issue of inclusion, of collaboration has come through loud and clear in the panel discussion that we've had. We've got roughly 8 minutes left. And so on that very broad note, Linda Godfrey, perhaps you can give us your concluding thoughts on this idea of how we achieve this in South Africa. If we are to have a sustainable plastics industry, it's going to require the mobilization of everyone in the entire value chain. What Kevin was saying earlier, though, is very important because it speaks to this pre-competitive collaboration that we perhaps don't see, and it's not in the DNA of certain actors in the value chain. So how do we achieve this in South Africa?
Thanks, Michael. And I think this is probably where, I want to play the devil's advocate, because in thinking about this question, one of the things that kind of kept playing through my mind is, what do we mean by a sustainable plastics industry? And I mean, I realize that's the point of, of the last 2 days and why we've been here. And I think, reflecting on what we heard yesterday from AMI that at the global scale, virgin plastic consumption will continue to increase, although not at the same rate of growth of recyclate. And we also heard from them that plastic waste entering the waste stream will increase at a higher rate than the production of recyclate. So in other words, recycling is not going to keep up with plastic waste production. We also saw yesterday that around about 50% of virgin polymer demand, at least in 2019, was for packaging. So whether it be consumer or industrial packaging, but it's for these short-lived products. And we heard this morning from Professor van Blotnitz that greenhouse gas emissions from the South African plastic sector are significant, with the bulk of those emissions coming from the early resin production and conversion stages. So we're producing a lot of plastic with associated environmental impacts at the production stage, much of which is used for short-lived products and very little of which is actually being returned back into the economy. We've also heard today from LCA specialists that often the impact of the packaging is small compared to the production of the product inside the packaging, although this does vary. And we've also heard about various innovations in product design. So the thing for me is that, in the 2 days, there's been this starting assumption that the plastic will be produced, and produced in growing volumes And then in terms of upstream interventions, how do we design products for circularity? How do we unlock opportunities for bio-based alternatives? And in terms of downstream interventions, how do we grow mechanical and chemical recycling? And I think the point of a system change has been touched on, but certainly the Breaking the Plastic Wave study, which was released last year, which kind of evidenced this discussion for the first time, showed us that we do need the system change. And the system change scenario actually talks about peak virgin plastic being reached in 2027, which is obviously not a very attractive position or future to look at if you're in the plastics industry. So I think for me, in terms of looking at this question of a sustainable plastics sectors, I feel like the unanswered question for me after the 2 days is this issue of plastics consumption and growing plastics consumption. I realize it's not an attractive discussion for a plastics industry that's wanting to sell more plastic. But I think, can we continue to consume plastic, and particularly for short-lived products, can we continue to consume at the rate that we are? We heard yesterday again about population growth, about urbanization, about a growing middle class as the driver for all of this consumption. But do we have to accept that as the status quo, that is the way that it's going to be, and that these are the only ways that we can get products to consumers, for example? So, I also realize this discussion of consumption of products extends way beyond the plastics industry. This is a broader socio-economic discussion, but I believe that to create a truly sustainable plastics industry, we have to bring in the discussion, and we have to bring the discussion back to this issue of consumption, because I think we all know that the trajectory that we're currently on is an unsustainable one. And as I mentioned before, I think, if we're going to address these issues and the role that plastics plays within society and creating a sustainable industry, is that it's going to require these honest discussions between stakeholders, between industry, between government, between civil society, in terms of how we address which could become a significant burden on society. And I think certainly for Africa's position, we're kind of standing on the threshold at the moment in terms of the impacts of plastic on the continent. We're getting a very clear signal from Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of what that future could look like for the continent if we don't change things. And so I think, the timing couldn't be better for the kinds of discussions and difficult discussions that we need to have moving forward. Thanks, Michael.
And thank you for tackling the elephant in the room, Dr. Linda Godfrey. Thokozani, this idea of mobilizing the entire value chain around a circular economy, how do you see us achieving that in South Africa? What do you see as the DTIC's role in that?
Thanks, Michael. I think let me tackle this question in the following way. I think, first of all, I think what we need to do, we need to strengthen the platform to support circular innovation, right? And perhaps we need to incentivize the redesign and remanufacturing of plastics. Again, we need to stimulate the end market for recycled material. To drive the demand, I think companies equally need to commit to using post-consumer resins. We need to encourage industrial symbiosis. It might be happening, but I think with the scale at which it's happening, I think we need to look at in a very incremental way. We equally believe that I think we need to support the cross value chain dialogue and exchange of knowledge and build on experiences gained through existing global institution networks. Probably again, from the government point of view, we need to look at utilizing fiscal and regulatory measures to deal with the negative effect of the unsustainable production and the use of plastics. And again, without these kind of measures, the market will continue to favor the fossil fuel feedstock, especially when the oil prices are low. Other regulatory and policy measures that probably we need to look at, the setting of a recycling target as it's pronounced within the EPR, and perhaps set mandatory requirements and standards for circular or eco-design. Well, public procurement, I think we need to use that kind of an instrument. It's available. we need to encourage the production of plastics from alternative feedstock, especially renewable. We need to kind of facilitate technical assistance and capacity building, especially in waste management, and broadly create that kind of an awareness-raising activities so as to encourage changes through educational material. And we need to equally discourage this culture of throwaway, right? And we facilitate the acceptance of a recycled product. I think in a nutshell, Michael, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Thokozani. Kirsten, last word is yours on this idea of how we achieve this big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG of uniting everyone in the value chain around a circular plastics economy.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm thrilled to be addressing this BHAG here. And just I think we have identified a common problem, and that is the first point around which we can mobilize. We have a common problem, which is the way we currently extract, make, use, dispose of, litter plastics in the economy. And if we've identified this common problem and that we all need to play a role, then we need to consider the hard facts and the evidence in front of us. We need to emphasize an evidence-based approach to move towards a circular economy for plastics. And that's exactly what Linda's just highlighted, that we do need to consider. It's very clear from a range of different studies, the most recent being the Pew report, is that we cannot consider and move towards a circular economy for plastics effectively if we don't consider virgin plastic production reduction, if we don't consider that peak plastic and aiming towards that peak virgin plastic in 2027. So I think we definitely need to address that. And it's something that we're addressing in our Target 1 action group, and we actually need to up the ambition levels of what we're looking at currently. And then I'd like to emphasize, we do see the EPR, the potential in our EPR. If you look at the targets on our EPR, they look at supply, they look at collection and recycling targets. Very interestingly, there is currently a reuse target in the regulations, currently unpopulated. And that's a very high value loop. You retain the material at a very high material value, often cycled very closely. And again, LCA studies, and there's been some excellent work also presented recently through UNEP, looking at, and it's something that Pippa Notton also emphasized, that reusable models see excellent environmental benefits. And please also do note that there is a bit of a tension there when you think of a reusable packaging versus lightweighting. Is reusable packaging needs to be more robust. So you'll lose out, and I think that was emphasized, but we do have lots of conversations with our members in the Pact where the ideal is seen as lightweighting rather than the ideal of being circularity. And sometimes circularity could mean a heavier in certain instances, and even as you've mentioned, possibly even removal of packaging. But very important to note that we're not thinking necessarily lightweighting, and it is also possible to lightweight to the extent that you cannot recycle that product at end of life. So you might lightweight and then design actually your product, your packaging for single use, and also then you reduce the potential to include recycled content. So we need to recognize these competing sort of targets and goals. If we're aiming at circularity, and our evidence-based approach will push us in a certain direction. So I think that's very key to note. Also key to note, and I missed part of the LCA discussions earlier, unfortunately, but there's increasing work looking at developing better impact factors for end of life of plastics in the environment. We don't yet have a good handle on what plastics in the environment mean in terms of the health of ecosystems, in terms of human health. We do have some indications of what that might mean in terms of economic impacts on tourism, on shipping, on fishing industries, on certain related industries, but we still don't have a good handle on that. So please watch that space. And I think as we need to collaborate across, we're already seeing as a microcosm of the South African industry, this collaboration happening in our Plastics Pact action groups. So we celebrate Safripol as being the most innovative and adaptive resin producer, I think, locally, who've joined the conversation, who basically said, we've seen the writing on the wall. We've seen that we cannot just produce virgin plastics endlessly and look for continual market growth in virgin plastics. They've joined the conversation, and we do thank you for that. And we've already seen in our action groups where, for example, some of our retailers and brand owners have presented what they thought was a brilliant solution. Innovative pack design, it's lightweight, it's highly recyclable, it's got quite a high sort of paper or board component. Therefore, we must be doing fantastically environmentally. And then we have the waste management collectors, we have Luanda, and other of his colleagues come in and say, actually, that material has no value on the ground. We've seen producers, brand owners move away from clear or natural coloring in their bottles to a colored bottle. And the information we're getting back from Luanda is we don't collect that bottle, that colored bottle, because it doesn't have value, the same value end of life as the white or natural bottle. So we need these collaborative discussions. We've already seen some innovations and changes as a result of that collaboration, and we welcome further discussions.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
It is a journey. Thank you very much. I think a warm round of applause for all of our panelists, everyone.